Video we're going to do some practice around banks, and we're actually going to do practice based on that spreadsheet that you filled out in the previous lecture. And the most important part is actually this one, right? That 1 over the reserve ratio is equal to the money multiplier. We have to remember that in order to do this page. So first, it says assume the required reserve ratio is 10% and all banks lend out the other 90%. All the money lent out by one bank is redeposited under these assumptions. If a new deposit of 1,000 is made, the initial deposit of 1,000 increased bank reserves by. Well, and my students have pointed out to me, well, are we assuming that it's immediately lent out? Because if it's immediately lent out, then the bank reserves only go up by $100. But assuming for a second the initial deposit just increases bank reserves by $1,000, because assume that maybe they haven't lent out that 90% yet. But they will very soon. So if you read it the other way, and again, I'll probably change the verbiage of that going forward, it could be read two different ways. Now, it says eventually this led to a total of $10,000 expansion of bank deposits, of which blank of which was because of the original deposit, while blank was because of bank lending. Well, of the $10,000 expansion of bank deposits, $1,000 comes from the original deposit. So that means $9,000 had to be from bank lending. So bank lending created $9,000. Therefore, if the fractional reserve had been 15% instead of 10, the amount of deposit expansion would have been more or less than in this example. Well, if the bank couldn't loan out as much, then that $9,000 wouldn't be as big. So we would say it would be less. If the fractional reserve had been 5% instead of 10, the amount of deposit expansion would have been more. Well, that's because they could loan out more. If banks had not loaned out all their excess reserves, the amount of deposit expansion would have been more or less. Well, if they don't loan out as much, then again, that $9,000 doesn't happen, so we'd say less. And if all the loans had not been redeposited in the banking system, the amount of deposit expansion would have been less. And that's because then the banks couldn't have loaned out as much. Now, problem 2. Assume that $1,000 is deposited in the bank, and that each bank loans out all its excess reserves. For each of the following required reserve ratios, calculate the amount shown. Okay, so for these, we just remember 1 over the reserve ratio. So 1 over 0.01 is 100. 1 over 0.05 is 20. 1 over 0.1 is 10, 4, and 2. Now, the maximum increase in the money supply. Now, students often will go, oh, $1,000 times 100 is 100,000. No, it's not 100,000. It's 99,000. Okay? Because the change in the money supply isn't going to be $100,000 because that original 100,000 was already in the money supply. So we go 100, that's the multiplier, times the 1,000 minus the amount that was already in the money supply, and that's $1,000. So that gives us 99,000. Now let's do it on this next one. 20 times 1,000 is 20,000, but again, 1,000 of it was already in the money supply, so we'd say 19,000 is the maximum increase in the money supply. And then we have 9,000, and here we have 3,000, and here we have only $1,000 is the actual increase in the money supply. Okay, let's take a look at problem 3. The Bank of Clayton has the following balance sheet. And this is actually the same balance sheet as the one from the previous problem set when we were doing this Bank of Clayton problem. Suppose that an individual deposits $5,000 in cash into her checking account. What's the maximum possible change in the money supply as a result of the cash deposit? Well, in order to answer this, we first have to know what's the reserve ratio, because then we do the money multiplier, and then we can figure out the maximum increase in the money supply. So the reserve ratio, this is a problem from last time, is 2,000 to 10,000. So we're going to write that off to the side. Reserve ratio is equal to 0.2. It's always useful with a T-account problem to just figure that out before you do anything else. If that's 0.2, then that means the money multiplier is 1 over 0.2, which is 5. Okay, now we can actually do this problem. $5,000 in cash times 5, right? 5,000 times 5. But the change in the money supply, so was the $5,000 already in the money supply? Yes, it was. Minus 5,000. So this is going to be $20,000. Right? It's not going to be 25,000 because that 5,000 was already in the money supply. And this question is asking about the change in the money supply. Now, what are true reasons the money supply might not change as much as you indicated? Well, in fact, the two reasons are right here. They're E and F. If banks had not loaned out all their excess reserves, the amount of expansion would have been less. And if all the loans hadn't been redeposited in the banking system, the amount would have been less. So we can say, first, people hold cash. People hold cash. The other way to say that is they don't redeposit. They don't redeposit. And then the second reason would be banks hold excess reserves. Excess reserves. So the other way of saying that is they don't loan, so they don't redeposit at all. They don't loan at all. That's the other way to say that. And both of those would make it so that this isn't the maximum change in the money supply. So hopefully this has helped you a little bit with understanding some of the practice problems that you're likely to see with banks. I'll see you next time.